The ground shook as the alien warships descended, casting dark shadows over the ravaged landscape. The planet had already been torn apart by years of conflict, a place where the ashes of human colonies mixed with the remnants of failed alien invasions. These new invaders, part of the Morix Dominion, were unlike any the human forces had faced before: superior technology, immense strength, and unmatched combat prowess. Their reputation for swift, brutal victories across the galaxy was well known, and humanity's defense had always been weak in comparison. Now, they were here to finish the job. A small human resistance force, backed into a corner and outmanned by the Morix, had made one final stand in a dilapidated city. Among them was Sergeant Daniel Harris, a man whose face was bloodied and bruised from countless hours of battle. His uniform was tattered, and his body ached from the unrelenting assault. His squad, what was left of it, had been wiped out in a failed attempt to push the invaders back. Only Harris remained, barely able to stand, but still clinging to the hope that somehow, against all odds, he could hold out just a little longer. The Morix soldiers emerged from their ship, their tall, imposing forms casting long, menacing shadows over the soldier. Their skin was a deep shade of green, their armor sleek and covered with glowing insignia of the Dominion. Their weapons, energy-based and far more advanced than anything humanity possessed, hummed as they powered up. They moved with an eerie precision, as if there was no question in their minds that the humans they were hunting down were nothing more than pests to be crushed. Harris, struggling to catch his breath, lifted his rifle, even though his hands were trembling and his vision blurred. He had fought in wars, seen comrades fall, and yet nothing had prepared him for this moment. But he couldn't give up, not yet. A Morix captain, towering over the rest, approached him with slow, deliberate steps. He towered like a living mountain, his face a mix of disdain and amusement. His voice was calm but carried an edge that sent a chill through Harris's spine. "You're a fool, human," the captain said, his words deep and guttural. "You think you can stop us? You've fought valiantly, but your kind is weak. You cannot even withstand the most basic of our weapons. Surrender. It will be over faster." Harris gritted his teeth, his blood boiling with anger. The captain's words weren't just an insult to his squad, but to every human who had ever stood up against oppression, against overwhelming odds. He wouldn't let them think for a second that they could break him. Slowly, he forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Not today," Harris muttered. "Not as long as I'm breathing." The captain chuckled darkly, stepping forward until he was directly in front of Harris. He didn't even bother to raise his weapon. Instead, he reached down and grabbed Harris by the collar of his armor, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. Harris gasped, the pressure on his neck causing his breath to catch. "You still have the fire in you, human. It's amusing. But it won't save you. You should be grateful. We could end this quickly, but I want to savor the moment. Your kind, standing against us, it's laughable." The captain's voice was laced with a cruel amusement. "Tell me, how long do you think you can survive? What's left of your resistance?" Harris's vision was starting to swim. He could feel the pressure of the Morix's grip tightening, his body failing him under the strain. But something deep inside him refused to give in. He had seen this before, alien soldiers who thought themselves untouchable, invincible. But humanity had faced worse and stood its ground. And in his gut he knew there was still something they couldn't understand. Something that made them weak, even in their strength. He shifted slightly, trying to find his footing, though every movement was agony. Then, just as the captain's mocking laughter filled the air, something stirred in the rubble around them. Harris's eyes snapped to the wreckage of an old military vehicle nearby, half buried in debris. The Morix captain raised an eyebrow as he noticed the human's focus shift, but his grip didn't loosen. "What are you looking at?" he sneered. "Do you think you'll survive by distracting me with a pile of junk?" Harris didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the wreckage, but in his mind, he saw the device, one of humanity's last secrets. A relic, hidden away from the Morix's prying eyes. It had been meant as a weapon of last resort, a device of immense power that humanity had never fully understood but had hoped never to use. In that moment, Harris knew it was his only chance. He had to reach it, activate it, and trust that humanity's ingenuity would save them. With a surge of determination, Harris gathered all the strength he had left, forcing his hand to pull the small control panel hidden beneath his armor. The captain laughed again, unaware of the sudden shift in Harris's demeanor. But that laughter soon turned to confusion as the ground trembled beneath them, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. The alien soldiers paused, looking around in confusion. A brilliant pulse of light shot from the wreckage, a burst of energy that illuminated the entire battlefield. The Morix soldiers stumbled backward, their weapons momentarily powerless as they were overwhelmed by the energy. The captain's face twisted in shock as he tried to raise his weapon, but it malfunctioned. The entire force seemed paralyzed, their arrogance shattered in the blink of an eye. Harris, struggling to stay on his feet, felt the weight of the device surge through the air. His vision blurred, but his heart pounded with a sense of vindication. The Morix, once so sure of their victory, were now disoriented, caught in the very thing they had never expected, a human weapon. For the first time, Harris allowed himself a small, defiant smile. The Morix had laughed at him. They had laughed at humanity's weakness, at its fragility. But in that moment, the tables had turned. And they would live to regret it. The Morix captain stood still for a moment, staring in disbelief at the glowing energy emanating from the wreckage. His soldiers, once poised and confident, were now disoriented, their weapons sputtering uselessly in their hands. The pulse of energy continued to hum, a steady reminder of the power humanity had hidden from the galaxy's prying eyes. The human soldier, bloodied and battered, had done something that the Morix had never expected. The captain's confident sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had underestimated the human spirit. It was not just their ingenuity that had surprised him. It was their ability to survive, to adapt, to fight even when the odds were stacked against them. You actually did it, the captain muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. He was still holding Harris by the collar, but his grip faltered, the soldier's resistance now far more than he had anticipated. He had expected a quick, painless end to this. Instead, he was facing a moment of doubt. How? Harris, though barely conscious, managed to grin. His breath came in shallow gasps, but he didn't look away from the captain's bewildered face. You thought we were weak, didn't you? His voice was rough, but there was an undeniable edge to it. That we were just some primitive species for you to crush. You were wrong. The Morix soldiers, still reeling from the sudden disruption of their power, began to recover slowly, but their hesitation was evident. They had never faced this kind of resistance before, not from a race they considered beneath them. The captain's expression turned from confusion to anger as he raised his hand to signal for the troops to fall back into formation. Weapons malfunctioning, one of the soldiers muttered, still trying to restore his gear. It's too much power, sir. The systems can't handle it. The captain's eyes narrowed, fury starting to burn through the doubt. This ends now, he growled, his hand tightening on Harris's collar again, lifting him off the ground. Do you think this device can save you? You're already defeated. But Harris's smile never wavered. You didn't think we had anything left, did you? He rasped. This is just a taste. This is why you'll never win. You rely on strength, technology, and arrogance. But we'll fight until there's nothing left. Even when we're on the edge of extinction, we keep fighting. The captain hesitated, the words striking a chord deep within him. His soldiers had been bred for war, conditioned to believe they were the pinnacle of life in the universe. The Morix dominion had wiped out species in the blink of an eye, and yet, here they were, struggling against a single, wounded human soldier. This human wasn't even fighting back in the way the Morix were used to. There were no grand technological weapons, no overwhelming firepower. It was raw human will. And it was something the Morix had never accounted for. The alien leader stepped back, glancing over his shoulder at his troops. They were clearly unsettled, the energy of the weapon reverberating through their bodies, disrupting their equilibrium. The Morix had long been the hunters. They were not accustomed to being on the receiving end of a surprise. This wasn't a victory for them. It was a miscalculation, a mistake they couldn't afford to ignore. "Bring him down," the captain ordered, his voice now sharp and commanding. "We end this now. Focus fire on that human." But his soldiers, no longer fully confident in their advantage, hesitated. The human had already shown them that their technology was not infallible. In that brief moment of uncertainty, Harris saw an opportunity. With the last of his strength, he wrenched his body free from the captain's grip. He dropped to the ground in a crouch, the device still glowing in his hands. The Morix soldiers, momentarily unsure of how to proceed, faltered. In that silence, Harris moved. His fingers found the hidden switch on the device, and with a final effort, he activated it again. Another pulse of light, more powerful this time, surged outward, sweeping over the Morix soldiers. The captain raised his weapon in a futile attempt to shield himself, but the energy washed over them all, incapacitating them once more. Their armored suits flickered, their strength fading as the pulse disrupted the very systems that had made them so formidable. Harris fell to his knees, his vision darkening, but he could hear the chaos around him, the alien soldiers scrambling to regain control, their weapons useless against the onslaught of human ingenuity. The tide had turned, and the Morix, for the first time, found themselves on the back foot. The captain's fury turned into something else, an emotion he hadn't felt in years: fear. He snarled and barked orders, but his voice was weak, uncertain. "Fall back! Regroup! We must retreat!" It was too late. The human soldier had done what no one had ever expected. He had turned the invincible into the vulnerable, the unbeatable into the defeated. The Morix, for all their strength, had never been prepared for this: human resilience, human ingenuity. It was not just a physical weapon that had been unleashed upon them. It was a reminder that humanity, even in its weakest moments, had the ability to surprise, to innovate, and to fight. The Morix soldiers, now reeling, were forced to retreat. Their weapons were no longer effective, their once pristine armor damaged and malfunctioning. The captain, growling in frustration, ordered the retreat, his voice more a hiss than a command. Harris, watching the aliens scramble to escape, felt a sense of satisfaction settle over him. He had no idea how long he could hold on, but he had done what he set out to do. He had proven that humanity's strength wasn't just in their technology, or their weapons. It was in their refusal to bow down, to give up when all seemed lost. The Morix had underestimated them. And now, they would regret it. The Morix soldiers scrambled to regain control, their once pristine armor flickering as systems failed and weapons malfunctioned. Their bodies trembled as the pulse of energy surged through the air, leaving them stunned and disoriented. The battlefield, once dominated by their overwhelming force, had now become their undoing. The human soldier, who they had mocked and underestimated, had turned the tables on them with nothing more than raw determination and a forgotten weapon. The Morix captain, still staggering from the blast, was momentarily dazed. His helmet had cracked under the intensity of the pulse, and his vision blurred as he tried to focus on the retreating soldiers. His once commanding voice was now faltering, filled with frustration and disbelief. "What's happening? Get up! Get your systems online!" he barked, but his orders lacked the usual authority. His confidence had evaporated. A soldier nearby struggled to power up his suit, but the systems were locked, unresponsive. "Captain, the energy surge. It's overridden everything. We can't fight back." The captain's face twisted in anger, but his attempts to reign in control were futile. He had led countless successful campaigns across the galaxy, crushing entire civilizations without breaking a sweat. But this human had outsmarted them. He had done the unthinkable. The captain's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. The human soldier had triggered an ancient weapon, something far beyond anything the Morix had expected. He had believed humans to be primitive, no more advanced than insects, harmless and easily crushed. Now, the captain was realizing the terrible truth: humanity's potential was far greater than he had imagined. The weapon had been a surprise, yes, but it was not just the weapon itself, it was what it symbolized. It symbolized the very heart of humanity, adaptability, creativity, and an unwillingness to accept defeat. Harris, still on his knees, could barely keep his eyes open. The effort of activating the device had taken nearly everything out of him. His breath was shallow, his vision clouding with darkness. But as the Morix soldiers stumbled, their systems failing, and the captain's voice turned to frantic commands, Harris knew he had won. The aliens, once so confident in their superiority, were now nothing more than frightened, vulnerable invaders. Despite the blinding pain that coursed through his body, Harris forced himself to lift his head. He had done it. The power of human ingenuity had brought them to this point. The captain's orders grew desperate as he tried to rally his troops, but there was no more strength in his voice. The Morix were broken. The weapon had done its job. It had struck at the heart of their arrogance, and they had no response. The human soldier's defiance, his refusal to surrender, had proven that the Morix were not as invincible as they believed. Harris, though severely injured, had achieved something monumental. Not just by activating a powerful weapon, but by showing that humanity's spirit could never be extinguished. The Morix had relied on brute strength and technology, but they had overlooked the one thing that had always been humanity's true weapon, the will to survive. The captain, still grasping at any semblance of control, ordered his remaining soldiers to fall back. Their retreat was slow, their movements uncoordinated. The once mighty Morix soldiers were now little more than broken machines, scrambling for cover, trying to regain their bearings in the face of an enemy they had underestimated. It was a sight Harris would remember forever. The very soldiers who had laughed at him, who had dismissed his kind as weak, were now the ones retreating in disarray. Harris forced himself to rise to his feet, though his legs wobbled beneath him. He stumbled forward, each step an immense effort, but he wasn't about to let them escape without hearing his words. His voice, though weak, carried the weight of everything humanity had fought for. "You underestimated us," he said, his voice rough but defiant. "You thought you could crush us, that we were nothing. But you've learned the hard way. We'll fight until there's nothing left. We'll adapt. We'll survive. You won't be the last ones to make that mistake." The Morix captain, now turning to retreat, paused as he heard Harris's voice. For the first time, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The human soldier had been right. They had made a grave error. Their arrogance had blinded them to the fact that humanity was more than a collection of primitive creatures. It was a species that would not bend to invaders, no matter how advanced or powerful. The Morix had learned this lesson far too late. With a final, defeated glance, the Morix captain motioned for his soldiers to fall back. Harris watched as they disappeared into the smoke and chaos, retreating to their ships, leaving behind a battlefield that had once seemed so certain of their victory. But now, it was theirs to claim. The air was still, the echoes of the battle fading into the distance. Harris, barely able to stand, looked at the wreckage of the Morix machines, his hands trembling. The weapon had done its job, but it had come at a cost. His body felt like it was being torn apart, but the victory was worth it. He had stood alone against the invaders, and he had made them regret underestimating humanity. As the dust settled and the noise of the battle quieted, Harris took a moment to let the weight of what had just happened sink in. The Morix would leave this planet, but the story of their defeat would travel far. And with it, the lesson: humanity was not to be trifled with. The Morix had thought they could crush humanity with ease. But they had learned that even in the darkest moments, when humanity seemed on the brink of destruction, it would find a way to rise. The Morix had underestimated one soldier, but in doing so, they had underestimated the entire human race. And that, Harris knew, was their biggest mistake. The Morix fleet withdrew in disgrace, their once pristine warships retreating from the battered planet with the unmistakable scent of defeat hanging in the air. The alien soldiers had underestimated humanity in ways that could never be undone. As their ships ascended into the sky, Harris could see them retreating in the distance, but the victory he had earned felt hollow. The weight of the battle was crushing him, his body weak from exhaustion, but his mind was clear. The Morix had learned a hard lesson, but they were not the only ones who would remember this day. The Morix had long believed that their power came from their strength, their advanced technology, their mastery of the universe. But it wasn't just their weapons or their ships that had made them so feared, it was their arrogance. The Morix had spent centuries conquering weaker species, wiping out civilizations, and claiming worlds as their own. They had seen humans as little more than pests, primitive, weak, and easily crushed. What they hadn't seen was the heart of humanity, the relentless drive to fight, to adapt, to survive. That was what had defeated them. That was what had broken their arrogance. Harris took a few steps forward, his injured body protesting with every move. His hand clutched at the hilt of his rifle, but the weapon felt heavy in his grasp. He had no strength left to hold it up. His fingers shook as he reached up to remove his helmet, the air feeling colder against his skin. He didn't have the energy to celebrate. He had no desire for the accolades that would come. What mattered now was the simple fact that humanity had survived, against all odds. He had shown the Morix that no matter how many worlds they conquered, they would never defeat the spirit of humanity. And that, in itself, was a victory. As he stood there, the quiet aftermath of the battle stretching before him, Harris thought about his fallen comrades. They had fought bravely, every one of them giving their all for a cause that seemed impossible to win. Their sacrifice had made this moment possible. They had given everything, knowing that their chances of survival were slim, but still they fought. Harris had seen the same resolve in their eyes, the refusal to give in, no matter how many times the odds were stacked against them. That was the human way. That was why the Morix had failed. He took a slow, unsteady breath, his vision fading at the edges as the exhaustion began to take its toll. But even as his body screamed for rest, his mind stayed sharp. He thought of the humans who would hear of this victory, of the message that would spread throughout the galaxy. Humanity was no longer a species to be dismissed. The Morix had learned that lesson, and they would never forget it. And so would the rest of the galaxy. The humans had survived. They had shown that no matter how superior an enemy seemed, no matter how powerful their technology, or their weapons, humanity would rise. It wasn't just about brute strength, it was about the human will to adapt, to learn, and to fight back. The Morix had believed that they could break humanity, that they could extinguish the spirit that burned within every human soul. They had been wrong. And now, the galaxy would know it. As Harris struggled to remain upright, the faint sound of footsteps approached. He didn't have to look to know it was another human soldier. One of the few survivors from his unit, still alive but barely. The soldier stopped beside him, glancing at the wreckage and the remnants of the battle. "They're gone," the soldier said, his voice rough but filled with awe. "We actually did it." Harris nodded, his lips barely able to form a smile. The victory felt strange, distant, but he knew it was something the human race could never forget. "Yeah," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "We did." The soldier didn't speak for a moment, then added, "We've shown them, Harris. We've shown the universe. They won't forget this." Harris closed his eyes for a brief moment, his heart heavy with the weight of their triumph. The battle had been won, but the cost had been high. So many had given their lives for this moment. But as the Morix ships disappeared into the distance, he realized something. The Morix would never forget. And the rest of the galaxy would know that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't just the Morix who would regret their arrogance. It was every empire that thought they could crush humanity underfoot. The message would echo across the stars: humanity had fought and survived. And if they ever came again, they would find a species that was far more than they could ever imagine. The soldier next to Harris gripped his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. The two of them stood there for a long time, watching as the last of the Morix forces fled the planet, knowing that the world they left behind had been irrevocably changed. This would be a story passed down through generations, a story of resilience, of courage, of an unwillingness to bend. The Morix would remember their defeat, and the rest of the galaxy would learn what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. No longer would they be the underdogs. They had shown their strength, their resolve, and their refusal to be conquered. And as the soldiers stood in the silence of their victory, they knew one thing for certain: the Moricks would never make the mistake of underestimating humanity again.